Hi, I'm Spencer Abruzzese. Today is April 14th, 2011, and I am sitting here with Mr. Robert Chamberlain, who is a member of the Bologna class of 1960, SAIS Washington class of 1961. How are you today?
Fine, thank you.
Good. So tell me, how did you first hear about SAIS?
To tell the truth, I don't quite remember how I heard of SAIS. I graduated from Georgetown in 1959 and was interested in pursuing a master's. And I had studied international affairs at Georgetown. But at the time, I was out of funds, and I knew I didn't have much of a chance of going on to graduate school if I did not have a scholarship. So I applied to SAIS for a scholarship. It was very convenient since it was here in Washington. And when I came for my interview, one of the professors looked at my academic record, and I had had lots of Latin, foreign languages, Greek, German, a little bit of French. So he asked me if I would be interested in going to Bologna my first year rather than to SAIS. And I have to confess, I was not very good in geography. I didn't know where Bologna was. It sounded like a city maybe in Romania. But I told him no, I would prefer to come to SAIS first. Went home and waited until I heard from the committee. And then I had an offer of a scholarship, and it was to Bologna first. So I was very pleased to accept it. It was a partial scholarship, but nevertheless it was enough to get me started. And that's how I started in SAIS.
And what's your most vivid memory of the Bologna Center?
Well, I think the thing that struck me most was half of the student body was from the U.S. and the other half was from all over Europe. And it was a wonderful experience to meet all these other students. The system, the school was run as a U.S. graduate school would be, which is very different for the Europeans. But the interaction and being able to visit different locales in Europe at the time, it was a very exciting time. We took one trip to Berlin. I remember going through the Iron Curtain. It was a very creepy feeling. Berlin was a very special city at the time. I can only describe it as having an electric atmosphere because the people knew that they were living in a very precarious situation. We also took a trip to Common Market, and that was another wonderful trip. So I would say the two trips and the opportunity to interact with all the Europeans was very special.
Mm-hmm. And when you came back to SAIS Washington, what did you concentrate in?
I was concentrating in European studies, and I was studying German at the time. I had a very good, very demanding German teacher, and it's a fascinating language because it only gets more difficult the longer you study it. We had some wonderful professors at the time, Professor Tucker, Professor Franklin in diplomatic history. And I was getting a little tired of studies in general, but it wasn't until my year here at SAIS that all these different disciplines began to come together. And I could say that I actually enjoyed studying and matching up the different courses. I also took a course with Roger Hilsman, who became, I believe it was a national security advisor to John F. Kennedy. It was right after the election, so he left this I don't think we finished the term, but it was rather exciting. It was also very interesting because we'd come to his seminar, and it was quite easy to get him off the topic in order to discuss politics at the time. So that was a pretty exciting course also.
So you were also having an education in current events as well.
Right.
And what's your most vivid memory about being in Washington at the time? What was Washington like?
Well, I have one very interesting recollection. It was at that time, SAIS was located over on Florida Avenue, and it was the night before JFK's inauguration when they had a terrific snowstorm here in the district. I was in my room studying, and I heard a broadcast requesting volunteers to come and help shovel the inauguration route, the inaugural parade route. So I was getting a little tired of what I was studying at the time, put on my boots, walked down to Georgetown from 19th Street, only to learn that they didn't want the volunteers there in Georgetown. They wanted them on Capitol Hill. So I walked from Georgetown to Capitol Hill, got there shortly after midnight, was put on a truck to go stand by a dump hole. For those who don't know what they do with the snow when they shovel it, they load it in the trucks and then they take it to different spots in the city and they dump it down into the sewage system so it goes into the Potomac. Well, I stood there by that dump hole for 2 hours before any trucks came. And of course, I'd worked up a good sweat walking up to the Capitol. By the time the truck came, I was frozen. So I said I was heading back home. Got in the truck, went back to the Capitol, and then walked home from there. So I never shoveled a single shovelful of snow for JFK's parade. And about 4 weeks later, I got a nice check in the mail for the 2 hours I'd stood there doing nothing.
Well, you were a student. You probably needed those funds.
Oh, I did indeed. It was very helpful.
And what did you do after SAIS?
Well, I joined the Foreign Aid Program. At that time, it was the International Cooperation Administration. But Kennedy changed it to the U.S. Agency for International Development. And my first job was here in Washington, and then I went to Brazil. From Brazil to Vietnam, 2 years in Vietnam, back to an assignment in Washington. And then I went to where I might mention I was the first desk officer for the Portuguese-speaking colonies in Africa. And perhaps the highlight of my career was going out to the Cape Verde Islands and negotiating an aid agreement on behalf of AID and the newly elected government of Cape Verde. And to my surprise, the agreement was then entered into the State Department's history of treaties between the U.S. and other countries. So I have the rare distinction of being one of the few aid officers ever to sign a treaty on behalf of the U.S. government with a foreign country. But from there I went to Portugal and had another short period in Washington and then went to Sri Lanka. And again came back to Washington and then retired in 1987. So I had 26 years with AID.
And you worked in such interesting places.
Oh, I enjoyed every minute of it.
And what was your favorite country to live in?
Brazil. Brazil. It was the first. It was very difficult at the time. People were worried that northeast Brazil would go communist. It was leaning to the left. And I was there when they had the military coup, and the military took over, booted President Goulart out of office, and then established the military dictatorship, which was not good. But so it was an interesting time to be there.
And what was was that your most challenging assignment as well, do you think?
Probably, because trying to work with the Brazilian government in the Northeast, there was a Brazilian agency called SUDENE, the Superintendency for the Development of the Northeast. But it was riddled with leftists and, if not outright communists, it was always very hard to pin down. And they were not very friendly to AID. They weren't happy that we were there. They made it difficult to work. They would sometimes take the project agreements that you were working on and they would bury them in the paperwork in SUDENE, and you never knew what happened to it. So it was a difficult time to be there. And I might add, in terms of development, Recife did not have the amenities of most embassy countries around the world, or countries where the embassy was established. But that's what development is all about. You go to the more difficult places in the world. It's come a long way since then.
And what about, you mentioned Vietnam. What were you doing in Vietnam?
I was working in an organization, and I've forgotten. It was an organization set up consisting of both civilians and military, trying to promote the rural development in Vietnam. I wasn't very happy to be there. I thought it was a waste of time and money. We would sometimes have a project in a village that the military would then come along and bomb. And but President Johnson wanted every agency in the U.S. government to be contributing to the war effort in Vietnam. I thought it was a mistake that we ever got involved there. The Vietnamese were not on friendly terms with the Chinese. And of course, one of the justifications for our being there was that if Vietnam got their independence or went communist, that there would be a domino effect all over East Asia, that the Chinese would come in and run everything. And of course, it wasn't true.
And what years were you in Vietnam? That was
from 1970 until 73. I left perhaps 6 months before the fall of Saigon.
interesting time.
Yes, yeah. I might add, the day I arrived in Vietnam, the Viet Cong rocketed Saigon. The rocket landed not far from the hotel I was in. And the night I left, they blew up an ammunition dump just outside the city. But the explosion was strong enough that it blew open the door to my hotel room, the balcony door to the hotel room. And I thought Saigon was being attacked at that time. Went out on the balcony and watched, couldn't see anything happening, and went back to bed.
And then what was, you were also in Sri Lanka. What was Sri Lanka like?
Again, Sri Lanka was a very interesting country to work in. Shortly after my very first tour there, I was there 4 years altogether, the Civil War began, which was most unfortunate. And after that, it was very hard to really promote development in the country because it was very difficult. So they were rather tumultuous times. At the time I was in Portugal, Ambassador Carlucci was there. I don't know if people remember, but the U.S. government was very much afraid that Portugal was going to go communist. So it was a very exciting time to be there also.
Yeah. And the Cape Verdes have changed so much since when you were there. Have you had a chance to go back since they've become such...
Unfortunately, I've never been back since we signed the the aid agreements with them, but I know that they have come along. At the time I went there, they were suffering from an 8-year-long drought, so they were really in bad shape.
And how, in all these places that you worked, how did your SAIS education help you, or did you feel that it gave you certain skills, or?
Well, I think it was the discipline of studying and understanding a little better what was going on, particularly in Europe. But I must say, because I went to Latin America and then Asia, the only time I really had a chance to put the special training to use was my 4 years in Portugal. And at that time, Portugal was not a member of the Common Market or the European Union. But it was nice to know, some of the dynamics of what was going on in Europe.
And if you had to give any advice to a student who's coming to SAIS today, what advice would you give?
Well, I would say just to be persevering. At one time, when I took my oral exams when I was graduating from SAIS, I was asked to discuss the efforts to establish a European Union. And my first response was to talk about the attempts to form a common market. And the board was not too happy with that response. They wanted me to go back a little farther in time. So then I did some thinking, and I went back to Caesar and his invasion of Gaul, trying to bring Europe into the Roman Empire. And they weren't too pleased with that answer either. They thought I'd gone back a little too far. So I thought I was dead in the water. But it turned out I did pass. And so I would tell the students just to really study hard, appreciate what they learn, no matter what the results are, because it is going to benefit them in the long run. Particularly the language training is so helpful when you get into a diplomatic career, any career nowadays, with global business and humanitarian programs. The languages are very important. And of course, SAIS has always had an extremely good program for language training.
And what questions haven't I asked you that I should have asked you, that you think?
What's that?
Is there any question I should have asked you that I didn't, or something else that you would want to add?
No, I might say after I left aid, after I retired, I went to work for a private voluntary organization. Mm-hmm. I think that kind of organization is a wonderful way to start an international career. You may stay with a PVO if you first join them, but you will also get a wonderful experience, particularly the ones working in international programs. And so sometimes it's a little hard to get started. I remember I was trying to get into the UN at one point, and anytime you apply for a job in the UN, they want to know, well, what experience do you have? Well, working with PVOs or with the government is a wonderful way to get started.
Well, thank you. I think that concludes our
Okay,
interview.
good. Feel free to edit